Evan Carter moved quietly through the crowded airport terminal. His steps unhurried, his presence almost unnoticed. He preferred it that way. His soft leather jacket, paired with worn jeans and sneakers, was unremarkable, deliberately so. To the casual observer, he was just another traveler navigating the ebb and flow of pre-flight rituals. But beneath the quiet exterior lay a man of great influence, though he had no desire to flaunt it. At 72, Evan had spent a lifetime building Horizon Airlines from the ground up. The company was a reflection of his values: fairness, efficiency, and treating people with dignity, no matter their status. He had seen the world change, seen laws passed and societal norms challenged. Yet, he knew from experience that change on paper didn't always translate to change in hearts and minds. Today, he was on a mission. Though it wasn't listed on any itinerary, Evan had chosen this flight specifically, a routine route from New York to Dallas. He wanted to see how his airline truly operated when no one was looking. This was not a trip as the CEO, with handshakes and red carpets rolled out. Today, he was just Evan, passenger 4A, no different than anyone else on the manifest. At the gate, a bright young attendant scanned his boarding pass with a polite, practiced smile. He noticed the subtle difference in how she greeted the passenger ahead of him. A businessman in a tailored suit. The businessman received warmth, a lingering glance. A cheerful, "Have a wonderful flight, sir." Evan received efficiency. Nothing more, nothing less. He shrugged it off. It was nothing overt. A lifetime in his skin had taught him to recognize subtler shades of bias, the ones that hovered just beneath the surface. It didn't anger him anymore, it simply made him tired. Evan stepped onto the aircraft, his hand brushing the familiar curve of the doorframe. For a moment, pride swelled in his chest. Every detail of this plane, from the ergonomic seats to the efficient overhead bins, had been part of his vision. He had built this not alone, but with a team of people who shared his dream of what air travel could be. A place where everyone, from the first-class executive to the economy passenger heading home, felt valued. As he reached his seat in first class, he noticed the glances. They were fleeting, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. A passenger in the row behind him whispered to her companion, her eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. He imagined the thoughts running through her mind. First class? Him? Evan settled into his window seat, gazing out at the tarmac. He could feel the quiet tension, not unlike the hum of the engines as they warmed up. Across the aisle, a flight attendant named Nathan Hale stood poised, his uniform crisp, his expression carefully neutral. But as Nathan's eyes landed on Evan, a flicker of something passed over his face. Suspicion, perhaps, or judgment. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the polished mask of professionalism. "Good morning, sir," Nathan said, his tone clipped. "May I see your boarding pass?" Evan raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. "I showed it at the gate," he replied evenly. "It's standard procedure," Nathan said, though Evan noticed he wasn't asking anyone else. Without a word, Evan handed over the pass. Nathan examined it longer than necessary before handing it back with a curt nod. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice strained. "Please let us know if you need anything." Evan murmured his thanks, watching as Nathan moved on, his demeanor noticeably warmer with the other passengers. The subtle discrepancy wasn't lost on him. He'd seen it before in restaurants, stores, even boardrooms. The small ways people signal who they believe belongs and who doesn't. As the cabin filled, Evan took in the scene around him. An elderly woman in pearls chatted softly with the man next to her. A polished professional with a briefcase by his feet. The hum of polite conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of glassware as pre-flight drinks were served. Through it all, Evan felt Nathan's occasional glances in his direction, like a faint pressure that never quite eased. It wasn't hostility, not exactly, but it wasn't welcome, either. Evan leaned back, folding his hands over his lap. He had learned long ago that his presence sometimes made people uncomfortable. Though he didn't try to. He was simply himself, quiet, thoughtful, perhaps a bit too old-fashioned for the times. But there was something about him. Or rather, something about their assumptions of him. That drew out reactions like Nathan's. He could see it plainly. Even if they couldn't. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi to the runway. Evan stared out the window. Lost in thought. This was why he had chosen to travel this way. To see what others saw when they didn't know who he was. It wasn't the indignities that troubled him most. It was what those indignities revealed about the world he lived in. A world he still hoped to change. The plane lifted off smoothly. The city below shrinking into a patchwork of grays and greens. Evan closed his eyes for a moment. Letting the gentle sway of the ascent steady him. He would observe, as he always did, and when the time came, he would act not in anger, but with the quiet resolve that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. Because change, he knew, wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with fanfare or applause. It began in the small, silent moments, when someone dared to look a little closer, to listen a little harder, and to hope for something better. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, a quiet undertone to the activity in the first-class cabin. Evan Carter adjusted the seatbelt across his lap and reached for the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket. He wasn't particularly interested in reading it. He'd seen enough glossy photos of resorts and luxury cars to last a lifetime. But it gave him something to do. A way to deflect attention and blend in with the others. The tension lingered, subtle yet persistent, like a faint static in the air. Across the aisle, Nathan Hale moved efficiently through the rows, attending to passengers with a practiced ease that felt both polished and distant. His every interaction seemed choreographed. From the way he leaned slightly to hear a passenger's request to the brisk nod he gave as he moved on. It was clear he took pride in his work. But when his gaze landed on Evan, the seamless rhythm faltered, if only for a moment. Would you care for a beverage, sir? Nathan asked the passenger beside Evan, his tone warm and solicitous. The man, dressed in a sharp blazer, requested a glass of wine, which Nathan poured with a smile. When it was Evan's turn, Nathan's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. The warmth in his voice cooled. And for you, sir? He asked. His words clipped. Just water, thank you, Evan replied, keeping his tone polite but neutral. He watched as Nathan set the glass on his tray with a mechanical precision. Avoiding eye contact. Evan wasn't surprised. But that didn't make the moment any less disheartening. It was the little things that stayed with you, the slight tightening of a smile. The way a hand lingered just long enough to make you feel uninvited. In his years of traveling, he had learned to recognize these signs. The quiet messages people sent without realizing they were being understood so clearly. Across the aisle, the elderly woman he had noticed earlier, her pearl necklace catching the soft cabin light, gave him a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a surprising weight. Evan nodded back, grateful for the quiet acknowledgement. She had noticed. Then, people often did, even if they didn't say so. Nathan continued his rounds, his movements efficient and polished. Evan observed him with the detached interest of someone gathering pieces of a puzzle. It wasn't that Nathan was outright rude. That would have been easier to address. Simpler to name. Instead, it was his restraint. The way he held himself back in subtle ways that spoke volumes. The words were polite, the actions professional, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. You don't belong here. Evan leaned back in his seat, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest. He reminded himself to breathe, to let it go, but the thought lingered like an unspoken conversation. How often does this happen? How many people carry this weight silently, unnoticed by those around them? The flight attendants moved seamlessly into their next routine, distributing menus for the meal service. Evan accepted his with a quiet, thank you, which Nathan acknowledged with the barest of nods. He flipped through the options, more out of habit than interest. The offerings were familiar, a carefully curated selection designed to evoke luxury without overwhelming. As Evan considered his choice, he noticed Nathan's return, clipboard in hand. Have you decided, sir? Nathan asked, his tone bordering on impatient. Not yet, Evan replied, glancing up briefly. I'll need another moment. Nathan sighed, a barely audible sound, but loud enough for Evan to catch. Very well, he said, stepping back but remaining close. his clipboard clutched tightly as if waiting for an excuse to pounce. It wasn't just Evan who noticed. The man across the aisle's sharp blazer, wineglass in hand, looked up from his tablet. His brow furrowed. The elderly woman's eyes flicked toward Nathan, then back to Evan, her lips pressing into a thin line. A younger passenger seated 2 rows ahead turned slightly, her curiosity piqued by the unspoken tension. Evan finally gave his order. Keeping his tone steady, Nathan jotted it down with the same mechanical precision and moved on without a word of acknowledgement. The man across the aisle shook his head subtly, a silent gesture of disapproval that Evan caught out of the corner of his eye. As the meal service began, the cabin grew quieter, passengers absorbed in their plates or entertainment screens. Evan ate slowly, the flavors of the carefully plated dish barely registering. He felt Nathan's presence like a shadow, moving up and down the aisle, attentive to others but keeping a deliberate distance from him. It was a strange dance, one Evan had experienced many times before but never quite gotten used to. Nathan's behavior wasn't egregious enough to call out publicly, yet it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about the way Evan was treated, it was about what it represented. The silent judgments, the quiet exclusions, the unspoken rules about who belonged where. Across the aisle, the elderly woman leaned toward the man beside her. Though her voice was low, Evan caught snippets of their conversation. Quote, "Not right, you can see it. Can't you?" she murmured, her words heavy with concern. The man nodded, his expression thoughtful, clear as day. He replied softly, "But what can you do?" Evan set down his fork, his appetite gone. He looked out the window at the expanse of clouds stretching endlessly into the horizon. This wasn't new, it wasn't even surprising, but it was still disappointing. A reminder of how far there was to go, even after all these years. He turned back to his plate, determined to finish the meal. There was a long flight ahead, and he intended to keep observing, to see how far Nathan's assumptions would carry him. Evan wasn't looking for a confrontation. He wasn't even angry. He was simply tired of the weight people like Nathan carried and the way they so easily placed it on others without a second thought. For now, Evan would wait. He would watch, and he would let the story unfold in its own quiet way, trusting that, in time, the truth would come to light. The meal service concluded, and the cabin settled into a subdued quiet. Trays were cleared, and passengers shifted into their own rhythms, some flipping through books or magazines, others reclining their seats to rest. The dimmed lights cast a soft glow over the space, adding a layer of calm that belied the undercurrents of tension still rippling beneath the surface. Evan Carter placed his napkin neatly on his tray and leaned back, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. He had always found the view calming, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the smallness of individual concerns. But even the serene beauty outside couldn't completely soften the sharp edges of the morning's interactions. Across the aisle, the elderly woman in pearls he'd heard her addressed as Mrs. Eleanor Grant was sipping her tea, her gaze flicking occasionally toward him. It wasn't intrusive, just enough to suggest that she was aware, perhaps more than she intended to let on. Evan gave her a small nod, which she returned with a faint smile, her expression lined with an unspoken solidarity. Nathan Hale moved briskly up the aisle, his polished demeanor intact, though there was a noticeable edge to his movements when he neared Evan's row. It was subtle, an extra tightness in his jaw, a slight tension in the way he held his serving tray. To anyone else, it might have seemed inconsequential. To Evan, it spoke volumes. As Nathan passed by, a younger flight attendant, Evan recalled her name was Sophia Tran, appeared from the galley. Her steps quick but light. She had been unobtrusive throughout the flight, her professionalism quiet but genuine. Now, she moved with purpose, pausing at Evan's row. "Mr. Carter, is there anything I can get for you?" she asked softly, her tone warm and unassuming. Evan looked up, surprised by her directness. "No, thank you," he replied, offering a polite smile. "I'm fine." Sophia nodded but lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. She seemed to hesitate, as though weighing whether to say more, but ultimately moved on with a slight bow of her head. Evan watched her retreat, appreciating the contrast she provided to Nathan's curt professionalism. It wasn't just her kindness, it was the way she seemed to carry herself. As if aware of the small imbalances in the world around her and determined not to contribute to them. The cabin remained quiet for a time. The only sounds the occasional murmur of conversation and the soft hum of the engines. Evan noticed a subtle shift in the passengers' behavior. Mrs. Grant leaned toward the man seated beside her, a younger man in a blazer who had spent much of the flight absorbed in his tablet. Their conversation was low, but the glances they cast toward Evan were not. "It's not right," Mrs. Grant said softly, her voice tinged with indignation. "You've seen it, haven't you?" The man nodded, setting his tablet aside. "I have," he replied, his tone measured but firm. "It's subtle, but it's there." Evan turned his gaze back to the window, pretending not to notice. He had grown accustomed to these moments, small rebellions against the quiet injustices of the world. It was heartening, in a way, to see others recognize what was happening. Yet it also filled him with a familiar sadness. A reminder that such recognition often came only when the evidence was impossible to ignore. Nathan's return to the cabin broke the moment. He moved with the same brisk efficiency as before. But his gaze lingered on Evan's row. His expression unreadable. It was clear he had noticed the murmurs. The quiet exchanges between passengers. Whether they unnerved him or only hardened his resolve, Evan couldn't tell. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Nathan asked, his voice carefully controlled as he addressed Evan directly. "No, thank you," Evan said evenly, meeting Nathan's gaze. He saw something flicker there, irritation. Perhaps. Or a faint unease. It disappeared as quickly as it had come. Nathan nodded curtly and moved on, his shoulders slightly stiffer than before. The man across the aisle, who had been watching the interaction, shook his head and muttered something under his breath. "I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous," he said quietly to Mrs. Grant, though loud enough for Evan to hear. "The way he's treating that gentleman, it's uncalled for." Mrs. Grant's expression tightened. "It's more than uncalled for," she replied. "It's shameful." Their voices carried just enough to reach the younger woman seated 2 rows ahead. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowing as she glanced back at Nathan, who was now at the front of the cabin. "People notice," she said softly, addressing no one in particular. "Even when they think we don't. People notice." Evan felt a quiet warmth at their words. Though he remained still, his expression composed. He didn't need to speak. The passengers around him were saying everything that needed to be said. As the cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the transition to the flight's quieter hours, Evan allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of all the times he had seen this play out before in boardrooms, restaurants, even the sidewalks of busy streets. The patterns were always the same, the details changing only slightly with the setting. Assumptions were made, judgments rendered, and all too often, those who bore the weight of those assumptions were left to carry it alone. But not today. Today, the weight was shared, even if only in whispers and glances. And that, Evan thought, was something worth noticing. He leaned back, closing his eyes against the dim light. The flight would continue, as flights always did, carrying its passengers through the sky. But here, in this small, suspended space, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough to know that. For a moment, the quiet rebellion of a few voices had begun to ripple outward. Perhaps, Evan thought, that was how change always started, not with a roar, but with a whisper that refused to be ignored. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. The hum of the engines was a steady backdrop, blending with the occasional rustle of a magazine or the clink of glassware being collected by the crew. Evan Carter rested his hands on the armrests, his gaze lingering out the window. The horizon stretched endlessly, a tranquil reminder of how small they all were in the grand scheme of things. Yet even in the vastness of the sky, small acts and assumptions carried weight. Nathan Hale had kept his distance since the meal service, though his presence still loomed in subtle ways. Every now and then, Evan caught him glancing in his direction. It wasn't overt hostility, Nathan was too polished for that. But there was a sharpness in his movements when he came near Evan. A tension that betrayed his inner discomfort. Evan had chosen this flight to observe, to step into the shoes of a regular passenger. He had anticipated that not every interaction would reflect the values he had worked so hard to instill in his airline. But he hadn't expected Nathan's quiet but persistent attempts to exclude him from the unspoken club of first-class travelers. Each curt exchange, each glance filled with quiet judgment, was a reminder of the gap between ideals and reality. Nathan's next move, however, tipped the scale from subtle to undeniable. As the crew prepared for the in-flight drink service, Evan noticed Nathan walking briskly toward his seat. Clipboard in hand, his posture was stiff, his expression carefully controlled but tinged with something darker and unspoken challenge. "Excuse me, sir," Nathan said, his voice louder than necessary. Several nearby passengers looked up, sensing the tension in his tone. "I need to verify your boarding pass again." Evan turned his gaze from the window to meet Nathan's eyes, his expression calm. "I showed it to you earlier," he replied evenly. "Is there an issue?" Nathan's smile was tight, forced. "Just a routine check," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. The murmurs began almost immediately. Across the aisle, Mrs. Eleanor Grant exchanged a sharp glance with the man seated beside her, who folded his arms and leaned back in his seat. Another passenger, a younger woman 2 rows ahead, turned slightly, her brow furrowed as she watched the exchange. Evan reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the boarding pass, handing it over without a word. Nathan examined it closely, as if expecting to find some flaw, some reason to justify his behavior. After a long pause, he handed it back, his expression unchanging. "Thank you," he said, though his tone carried no gratitude. As Nathan turned to walk away, the man across the aisle spoke up, his voice firm but controlled. "What was that about?" he asked, his tone carrying the weight of the room's collective disapproval. "He's been sitting here quietly the whole flight. Why single him out?" Nathan froze, his grip tightening on the clipboard. He turned slowly, his polished veneer cracking just enough to reveal a hint of irritation. "It's protocol," he said, his voice clipped. "We have to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers." Mrs. Grant's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Comfort and safety?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "Because nothing says comfort like harassing a paying customer." The murmurs grew louder, spreading through the cabin like a ripple across still water. Passengers shifted in their seats, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Evan remained silent, his face composed, though his grip on the armrest tightened slightly. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such scrutiny, but it was rare for others to notice, let alone speak up. Nathan straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place. "I assure you, ma'am, I was simply doing my job." Mrs. Grant wasn't swayed. "I've flown more times than I can count," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "And I've never seen a flight attendant demand to see the same boarding pass twice. Not without good reason." Nathan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another voice joined the chorus. It was the younger woman, her tone calm but pointed. "We've all been watching," she said. "It's obvious what's going on here. You're treating him differently, and it's not subtle." The cabin fell into a tense silence. Nathan's gaze darted around the room, taking in the passengers' expressions. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, the weight of collective judgment bearing down on him. Evan finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. "Nathan," he said, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect. "If there's something you need to address, I suggest we handle it privately. There's no need to disrupt the entire cabin." Nathan hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Evan's composure. He seemed to struggle for a response. But before he could find the words, Sophia Tran appeared at his side. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. "Nathan," she said softly, though her voice carried enough weight to draw the attention of the room. "Perhaps it's best if we step aside and discuss this with the captain." Nathan glanced at her, his face a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. For a moment, it seemed he might argue. But the whispers in the cabin had grown louder, and the disapproval in the passengers' eyes was impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, he nodded. Sophia turned to Evan, her gaze filled with quiet apology. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, she said. If there's anything I can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. Evan gave her a small nod, appreciating her sincerity. Thank you, Sophia. Your professionalism is noted. As Nathan and Sophia disappeared toward the front of the cabin, the murmurs began to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. Mrs. Grant leaned over the aisle, her voice low but resolute. Don't you worry, young man, she said to Evan, her eyes glinting with quiet defiance. We've got your back. Evan smiled faintly, his gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. The confrontation had brought the tension to the surface, forcing it into the light where it could no longer be ignored. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start, a moment of truth that couldn't be brushed aside. He turned back to the window, watching the clouds drift by. The flight would go on, as it always did, but something had shifted. For the first time, the weight of Nathan's assumptions wasn't his alone to carry. The plane cruised steadily through the skies, a hushed calm settling over the cabin after the earlier confrontation. Passengers shifted in their seats, some glancing at Evan Carter with curiosity, others leaning toward their companions to exchange quiet words. The air felt heavier now, not with anger, but with a collective unease. What had started as subtle glances and polite indifference had transformed into an unspoken solidarity, as though the cabin itself had decided that silence was no longer acceptable. Evan sat still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window. The endless expanse of clouds seemed to stretch into eternity, offering a momentary escape from the undercurrents in the cabin. Yet, even in the quiet of the sky, he could feel the weight of what had transpired. The steady rhythm of Nathan Hale's actions, small and sharp as they were, had disrupted something fragile in the atmosphere, exposing fault lines that were impossible to ignore. Sophia Tran returned to the cabin, moving with her usual quiet efficiency. She paused by Evan's seat, her expression one of genuine concern. Mr. Carter, she said softly, leaning in slightly so her words wouldn't carry. I've spoken with the captain. Please know that we're taking this seriously, and I'll do everything I can to ensure the rest of your flight is as smooth as possible. Evan met her gaze, his expression calm but thoughtful. Thank you, Sophia, he said. Your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed. She nodded, a faint smile flickering across her lips before she moved on to tend to the other passengers. Across the aisle, Mrs. Eleanor Grant watched the interaction with an approving eye. She adjusted the pearls at her neck, then leaned slightly toward Evan. Well, she said, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. You've handled all of this with more grace than I would have mustered. Evan chuckled softly, the sound low and restrained. Thank you, he replied. I've had plenty of practice. Mrs. Grant raised an eyebrow, her sharp eyes catching the nuance in his words. Practice, she echoed, her tone contemplative. That's a word that shouldn't be necessary for this sort of thing. Evan didn't respond, but his faint smile said enough. Mrs. Grant gave a small, approving nod and settled back in her seat, though her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. As the cabin lights dimmed for the evening, a quiet sense of anticipation seemed to ripple through the first-class section. Passengers who had earlier been content to keep to themselves were now stealing glances at Evan, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect. Some, like Mrs. Grant, seemed emboldened by the earlier confrontation, their posture more upright, their gazes more direct. Others remained quiet observers, their thoughts hidden behind polite exteriors. It was during this quiet lull that Evan reached into the overhead compartment and retrieved his briefcase. The sleek black leather glinted faintly in the dim light, its corners worn smooth from years of use. On its surface, near the clasp, was the distinctive logo of Horizon Airlines, a simple yet elegant design that Evan had personally approved decades ago. The briefcase drew attention almost immediately. Mrs. Grant leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she noticed the logo. Her breath caught, and she placed a hand lightly on her companion's arm. Wait a moment, she murmured, her voice tinged with realization. Is that? The man across the aisle, who had been watching silently, leaned closer, his brows furrowing as he, too, noticed the emblem. That's the airline's logo, he said softly, his tone carrying a note of astonishment. Evan, sensing the shift, looked up from his seat. His gaze met Mrs. Grant's, and for a moment, he considered deflecting, maintaining the anonymity he had carried through the flight. But something in her expression, a mix of curiosity and quiet encouragement, made him reconsider. Yes, he said simply, his voice steady. It is. The weight of his words hung in the air, rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water. Mrs. Grant's eyes widened, and she sat back in her seat, her lips pressing together in a knowing smile. Across the aisle, the man leaned forward, his expression a mixture of respect and wonder. You're not just a passenger. Are you? The man asked hesitantly, his voice low. Evan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I'm more involved with the airline than most, he said, his tone deliberate but humble. The murmurs began almost immediately, spreading through the cabin like a quiet tide. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting as they pieced together the significance of what they'd just learned. The woman 2 rows ahead turned in her seat, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Grant said, her voice carrying a new weight. You're the owner, aren't you? Evan inclined his head slightly, the gesture both a confirmation and an acknowledgement. The murmurs grew louder, and the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift once more, this time toward a collective realization. Sophia, who had been tending to another passenger, turned at the sound of Mrs. Grant's words. Her gaze landed on Evan, and as her eyes fell on the logo on his briefcase, her expression shifted. Mr. Carter? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize. Evan offered her a kind smile. That's the point, Sophia. Sometimes, it's best to observe quietly. Her cheeks flushed, and she nodded, her respect for him evident in her posture. Thank you for your patience, she said. I'll make sure this experience is handled properly. Nathan Hale, who had been hovering near the galley, froze. His face paled as the realization of Evan's identity washed over him. For the first time that flight, his polished mask slipped entirely, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The passengers' gazes turned toward him, their earlier disapproval now sharpened by the knowledge of who Evan truly was. Evan turned to Nathan, his expression calm but firm. Nathan, he said, his tone even, this is a moment for reflection. Not just for you, but for all of us. The words lingered in the air, their weight undeniable. Nathan's face flushed, and he looked down, unable to meet Evan's gaze. Around him, the passengers murmured their agreement, their quiet solidarity filling the space left by Nathan's silence. As the plane continued its journey, Evan leaned back in his seat, his briefcase now resting beside him. The cabin had grown quieter, but the atmosphere was charged with a new energy, one of awareness, of reckoning. Evan closed his eyes briefly, the hum of the engines steadying his thoughts. The unveiling had come quietly, without fanfare, but it had left its mark. In the stillness of the cabin, a quiet truth had emerged. Respect was not a privilege to be earned but a right to be extended. And that truth, Evan thought, was worth carrying forward. The flight descended toward its destination, the distant cityscape slowly coming into focus as the aircraft dipped below the clouds. Inside the first-class cabin, the earlier murmur of voices had quieted, replaced by an almost palpable sense of introspection. Evan Carter remained seated, his posture relaxed but his thoughts far from idle. The events of the flight had unfolded in ways that were both familiar and uniquely revealing. Around him, the passengers who had borne witness to the subtle tension seemed reflective, their glances toward him filled with a quiet respect. Mrs. Eleanor Grant sat upright, her hands resting on the polished clasp of her handbag. Across the aisle, the younger man who had spoken earlier leaned back in his seat, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as though lost in thought. Nathan Hale, standing stiffly near the galley, had retreated into an uneasy silence. The earlier confidence that had defined his movements was gone, replaced by a visible discomfort. His eyes rarely left the floor, his posture shrinking slightly with each passing moment. Evan glanced toward Sophia Tran, the younger flight attendant whose quiet professionalism had been a beacon of grace throughout the flight. She was assisting a passenger in the back of the cabin, her demeanor calm but purposeful. When her gaze briefly met his, she offered a small nod, as if to say, "I'm here, I see this too." The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their final descent. The reminder that the flight was nearing its end brought a sense of relief to the cabin, though the weight of the day's events still hung in the air. Evan knew that the real work would begin once the wheels touched the ground. As the plane approached the runway, Evan's thoughts turned to what lay ahead. This flight had been more than an uncomfortable experience, it had been a mirror, reflecting the quiet but persistent issues that too often went unaddressed. Nathan's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of something larger. A culture that allowed bias to fester in subtle, insidious ways. When the aircraft landed with a smooth jolt, a murmur of quiet relief rippled through the cabin. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual shuffle and soft conversations filling the space. But the first-class cabin retained its air of quiet observation, the weight of what had transpired preventing any sense of normalcy. As passengers prepared to disembark, Mrs. Grant turned to Evan, her expression resolute. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I've flown many times in my life, but I've never seen anything like what happened today. The way you handled it with such patience and dignity, it speaks volumes." Evan smiled faintly, his voice low. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant. Your support, and the support of everyone here, meant more than I can say." She nodded firmly. "You can count on me to share what I witnessed. This kind of behavior has no place anywhere, especially not in an airline like yours." Evan thanked her again, his gratitude genuine. As she stepped into the aisle to leave, others followed suit, some offering him quiet nods of respect, others murmuring words of encouragement. The man across the aisle paused briefly to shake Evan's hand. "We've all seen it," he said simply. "Thank you for addressing it. Not everyone would." When the cabin had nearly cleared, Nathan approached. His steps were hesitant, his face pale. He stopped a few feet from Evan, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with his words. "Mr. Carter," Nathan began, his voice low, almost a whisper. I want to apologize. I didn't realize who you were. And if I had." Evan raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. His expression remained calm, his voice measured. "Nathan, this isn't about who I am. It's not about my title or my position. It's about how we treat people, every person, regardless of their background or appearance." Nathan's face flushed, and he looked down, shame etched into his features. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was wrong to make assumptions. I shouldn't have treated you or anyone that way." Evan studied him for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Acknowledging that is the first step," he said, "but it's only a step. What matters is what you do next." Nathan nodded, his voice barely audible. "I understand." Sophia, who had been observing from a respectful distance, stepped forward. Her presence seemed to anchor the moment, her quiet strength a sharp contrast to Nathan's earlier bravado. Evan turned to her, offering a small but warm smile. "Sophia, thank you. You've demonstrated what professionalism and integrity look like. You reminded me of the values this airline was built on." Sophia's cheeks flushed slightly, but she held his gaze. "It's my job, Mr. Carter. But thank you." He nodded. "It's more than your job. It's a reflection of character. I want you to know that it hasn't gone unnoticed." As the last of the passengers disembarked, Evan rose from his seat, his briefcase in hand. The airport terminal loomed ahead, its bright lights a stark contrast to the dim quiet of the cabin. Walking toward the door, he paused beside Nathan, his voice low but firm. "This is a moment of accountability, Nathan," he said, "not just for you, but for this airline. Change begins with recognizing our mistakes and making them right. I hope you take this opportunity to grow." Nathan nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "I will, sir. Thank you." Evan stepped off the plane and into the terminal, his mind already turning to the work ahead. This flight had been a microcosm of a larger issue, one that demanded action not just in addressing Nathan's behavior, but in ensuring that every employee understood the values at the core of the airline. As he walked through the bustling terminal, Evan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. Change wouldn't come quickly or easily. But it would come. It had to. And it would start with him. The meeting room was quiet but charged with purpose. Sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, casting patterns across the polished table where Horizon Airlines senior leadership sat in rapt attention. Evan Carter, at the head of the table, leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together as he addressed the group. This is not just about one incident. He began, his voice low and steady. It's about the culture we've allowed to take root, the subtle biases, the quiet assumptions that shape how we treat one another. What happened on that flight was a symptom of something much larger. And it's our responsibility to address it. The room was silent. No one shifted in their seats or glanced away. The gravity of his words demanded full attention. Evan's presence alone was enough to command the room. But it was the depth of his experience, the quiet authority in his voice, that held them. Lydia Benson, the head of human resources, nodded thoughtfully. You're right, Mr. Carter, she said. This goes beyond one employee. It's a systemic issue. Training programs on bias and respect aren't enough if they're treated as box-checking exercises. Evan's gaze met hers, and he nodded. That's exactly why we need to rebuild from the ground up, not just retrain, but reimagine. We can't simply tell our employees to act with respect. We need to create a culture where it's ingrained in every decision, every interaction. Sophia Tran, seated near the middle of the table, shifted slightly. Her inclusion in the meeting had been a deliberate choice by Evan. Her actions on the flight had exemplified the professionalism and empathy he wanted to see in every member of his team. Mr. Carter, Sophia began, her voice calm but resolute. If I may, I believe the issue isn't just about bias. It's about how we define leadership. Too often, employees think of authority as something to wield rather than something to serve with. If we focus on fostering empathy as a leadership quality, I think it could make a real difference. Evan smiled faintly. Well said, Sophia. Leadership should always be about service, not power. And that starts with how we train, how we mentor, and how we hold people accountable. The group leaned in, their attention sharp as Evan outlined the plan he had been shaping since stepping off the plane. It would begin with a comprehensive overhaul of the airline's training programs. Mandatory workshops on implicit bias and respectful communication would be coupled with ongoing mentorship opportunities to ensure the lessons weren't forgotten. But Evan didn't stop there. We'll also be revising our onboarding process, he said. Every new hire will undergo a deep immersion into our core values. Respect, inclusivity, professionalism. These aren't just words for a mission statement. They're the foundation of who we are. Lydia nodded again. And for current employees, how do we ensure they internalize this shift? Evan paused, his gaze thoughtful. We lead by example. Every leader, myself included, will be held to the same standard. If we expect change, we must embody it. The weight of his words settled over the room, and there were nods of agreement all around. Evan allowed the silence to linger for a moment before speaking again. And there's one more thing, he added. I want this to be an ongoing conversation. Every quarter, we'll hold open forums where employees can share their experiences and concerns. It's not enough to impose change from the top, we need to listen. Sophia's expression brightened at this, and she leaned forward slightly. That could be powerful, she said. People need to feel heard. Evan gave her a small nod, appreciating her insight. Exactly. When people feel valued, they're more likely to treat others with the same respect. The meeting continued for over an hour, with every detail of the new initiative meticulously discussed. By the time it concluded, the room felt lighter, as though the collective resolve to effect change had shifted the atmosphere. As the team began to disperse, Evan called out to Sophia. Stay a moment, if you would. She approached the head of the table, her expression curious but composed. Yes, Mr. Carter? I want you to play a central role in this initiative, he said, his tone measured but firm. Your actions on that flight showed me exactly the kind of leadership we need. If you're willing, I'd like you to work closely with Lydia to shape the training programs. Sophia blinked, clearly surprised. But her composure held. "Thank you, sir. I'd be honored. It's well deserved," Evan replied. "You exemplify what Horizon Airlines stands for. And I want others to learn from your example." She smiled, the warmth in her expression unmistakable. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I won't let you down." Evan nodded, then gestured toward the window, where the city skyline stretched out under a clear blue sky. "Change is slow, Sophia, but it starts with people like you. People willing to see, to listen, and to act." Sophia followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Then let's get to work." The following months marked the beginning of a quiet transformation at Horizon Airlines. The new programs rolled out gradually but deliberately, with Evan taking a personal interest in their implementation. Employees from every department participated in workshops, discussions, and forums, their feedback shaping the ongoing evolution of the company's culture. Nathan Hale, having completed the mandatory training, approached his work with a newfound humility. Under the mentorship of seasoned leaders, he began to understand the weight of his actions and the importance of his role in representing the airline's values. For Evan, the journey was far from over. Each flight, each interaction, was a reminder of the work still to be done. But as he watched his employees embrace the changes, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Progress wasn't always dramatic, it often came in small, steady steps. But each step mattered, carrying them closer to the vision he had always believed in. The sky, after all, was vast enough for everyone. And that, Evan thought, was worth fighting for. The terminal was quiet in the early morning hours, sunlight filtering through the expansive windows as a new day began. Evan Carter sat in a familiar leather seat by gate 22. A steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Around him, passengers milled about, some engrossed in their phones, others chatting softly with travel companions. The rhythms of the airport felt comforting, a reminder of the shared journeys that connected people in unseen ways. Evan wasn't here to oversee operations or hold a meeting. Today, he was simply a traveler, blending into the crowd as he had on that pivotal flight months earlier. His casual attire, a well-worn jacket and jeans, drew no second glances. And that was just how he liked it. This flight wasn't about anonymity, though. It was about witnessing the fruits of the changes he had set into motion. As boarding began, Evan observed the gate staff with a quiet satisfaction. Their interactions with passengers were professional yet warm, each greeting imbued with a sincerity that felt genuine. When his turn came, the young attendant scanned his ticket with a smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard," she said, her tone light but welcoming. Evan returned her smile and stepped onto the jet bridge, his mind already reflecting on the changes he had seen over the past few months. Implementing the new training programs had been a significant undertaking, but the results were beginning to show. Employees at every level were engaging in conversations about bias, respect, and the values that defined the airline. The shift wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was steady like a tide rolling in. The cabin of the aircraft was bright and welcoming, the rows of seats impeccably arranged. Evan made his way to his seat. Not in first class this time, but in an aisle seat in economy. He had chosen the spot deliberately, wanting to observe how the new approach extended to every passenger, regardless of their ticket class. A flight attendant passed by as he settled in, her movements efficient but kind. She paused briefly to greet him, her tone carrying the same warmth he had seen at the gate. It was a small interaction, but it spoke volumes about the culture that was beginning to take root. As the plane filled, Evan noticed the diverse array of passengers boarding, a family with young children, a couple quietly discussing their travel plans, an elderly man in a worn sweater carefully placing his carry-on in the overhead bin. Each was greeted with equal courtesy, each treated as though they mattered. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone and providing details about the flight. Evan leaned back in his seat, letting the familiar cadence of pre-flight announcements wash over him. The engines roared to life, and soon the plane was taxiing toward the runway. As it lifted into the sky, Evan felt a sense of calm settle over him. Midway through the flight, the drink service began. The flight attendant, a young man with a friendly smile, stopped at Evan's row and offered a choice of beverages. "Anything for you today?" Sir? He asked. Just water. Thank you, Evan replied. The attendant handed him the bottle with a nod. Let me know if there's anything else you need. Evan watched as the attendant moved on. His interactions with the other passengers carrying the same effortless warmth. There was no distinction in how he treated people. No subtle differences based on appearance or assumptions. It was exactly what Evan had hoped to see, a quiet but profound shift in the way employees approached their work. A few rows ahead, he noticed a small moment that stayed with him. A woman traveling alone struggled to retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment. A flight attendant stepped forward immediately. Her movements smooth and purposeful as she helped the passenger with a reassuring smile. The gratitude on the woman's face was unmistakable. A brief but telling glimpse of how even the smallest gestures could make someone feel valued. By the time the plane began its descent, Evan felt a quiet sense of pride. The journey to transform Horizon Airlines was far from over, but it was well underway. The changes weren't just in the training sessions or the new policies, they were in the everyday interactions. The way employees carried themselves, and the way passengers were treated. As the plane touched down, Evan felt the familiar jolt of landing. The tires meeting the tarmac with a reassuring finality. The passengers began gathering their belongings. Their movements unhurried but purposeful. Evan waited until the aisle cleared before retrieving his bag and stepping into the flow of people disembarking. At the door, the lead flight attendant stood with a warm smile, thanking each passenger as they left. When Evan reached her, she extended the same courtesy. Thank you for flying with us today, sir. We hope to see you again soon. Evan nodded, his voice low but sincere. You will. Thank you. Stepping into the terminal, he paused for a moment, letting the steady hum of airport life surround him. The work he had done, the changes he had championed, were beginning to take root. It wasn't a grand victory or a dramatic conclusion, it was a series of small, steady steps towards something better. Evan knew that the challenges weren't over. Prejudice and bias didn't vanish overnight, and there would always be new obstacles to face. But he also knew that change, real change, began in moments like these. It was in the small choices, the quiet efforts, and the willingness to see and value every person. As he walked through the terminal, blending once more into the crowd, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't about him, it never had been. It was about creating a space where everyone felt they belonged, where respect wasn't a privilege but a right. The sky stretched wide and endless beyond the glass windows, its vastness a quiet reminder of possibility. Evan smiled to himself as he continued on his way, knowing that the legacy of what he had built was only just beginning.